Hi guys, this is Robin. Welcome to History with Robin. Thanks for joining me today. We are going to continue to talk a little bit about the Revolutionary War, and we're actually going to talk about two important people, I think important people of the Revolutionary War. As you can see, I am dressed up again. We're going to talk about Betsy Ross and Thomas Paine. And so this is my best impression at a Betsy Ross costume. Normally she'd be wearing like what's called a mob cap, a white cap that's kind of like this, but I didn't have one and I couldn't make one. So my shower cap is going to have to do, but normally it would be plain white cloth. So good. It looks like there are a bunch of people here. Hi, Mackenzie, Denali, Jacob, Natalie, thank you guys so much for joining me. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about two people that I think are really, really good or interesting people from the Revolutionary War. Thank you, Shayna, for saying it's a good impression. And hi, Nate. Yes, Lorna, Betsy Ross did supposedly sew the first flag, which is one of the reasons that we're gonna talk about her. Hi guys, thank you everybody. Hi Isabella, nice to have you on my webinar. Okay, so here, let's start my slideshow. Okay, so two people in US history that I really like, that I think are really interesting, are Betsy Ross and Thomas Paine. So here's a picture of Betsy Ross, a painting or a drawing. And someone mentioned that, that she did sew our first flag. So who was Betsy Ross and why do we study her? Well, according to legend, she made the first flag of the United States of America. There are many things in history that we actually have no proof for, but we look at all the stories, journals, things that people wrote, things that they said, and we kind of make our best guess about what happened. Because this was so long ago that there's not anybody still alive that lived at that time. So it's kind of hard to know exactly for sure that this did happen. But the best guess that most historians have is that she did make the first flag of the United States. Regardless of if she did make the first flag or not, she's a really interesting person to study about, which is why I picked her. Just 1 second. So Betsy Ross, her name, she was born with the name Elizabeth Grissom. And she was born in 1752 in what at the time was the British colony of Pennsylvania. So you guys can see in the map in the right where it's Pennsylvania. So that's where she's from. It's right about in the middle. I had actually read somewhere that she was a 4th generation colonist. The beginning of her family came over in like 1680 or something, were some of the first colonists to settle. Most of the original colonists of Pennsylvania were Quakers, and they arrived in 1682. Quakers were Christians, but some of their beliefs weren't the same as other Christians, and because of that, they weren't always treated well in Europe. So they decided to come, much like the Pilgrims, to the New World to have religious freedom. There were some things that they were against. They opposed slavery. They were against fighting in wars. So they believed that they didn't want to fight in wars. And they believed in treating Native Americans fairly and as friends. So Betsy Ross, she was a Quaker when she was younger. See if I have, we've got a lot of questions. So let me see. Why the different colors on that map? Just different colors to show where the different colonies were at that time, because otherwise I think they'd kind of look like they were all the same thing. Hi, Nora. Thanks for joining my webinar. And Abel, yes, they are good people. They were very fair and kind people. She actually, Nate, I think in my next one, she had a really large family. That was perfect to ask that question. She had 16 brothers and sisters. Can you imagine having 16 brothers and sisters? That would be a little crazy. So while she was a child, she went to a Quaker school and she learned lots of different skills, including how to sew. And she got really, really good at sewing. So when she was a teenager, her dad got her an apprenticeship with a professional so she could learn more. So what she did was she went and she lived with someone who sewed professionally so that she could work for them and learn all of those skills so she'd be able to make her own living, which was a very cool thing. And she learned to make tablecloths, she learned to make curtains, she learned to make bed covers, so like what we consider like a comforter or something, and rugs. Aubrey, good question. What is a Quaker? A Quaker is a Christian religion that Betsy Ross and her family were a part of, and they believed in being peaceful and kind, and they didn't want to fight in wars, and they were kind and caring to the Native Americans. Isabella, great question. What is a Quaker school? It is just a school for Quakers, people who believe in that religion. So just like there may be other schools that believe in certain religions, then those were Quaker schools. I'm not sure if the person that she worked for was a Quaker. And yes, at that time, you know, everybody made their own things. It wasn't like you could go to the shops and buy curtains like today you can. So people would have the job where they actually would take fabric and turn it into the things that the people wanted. While Betsy was working there, she met another apprentice whose name was John Ross, and they fell in love. So when she was 21, she wanted to marry John Ross, and at that time, they left Pennsylvania to move to New Jersey to get married. After they lived in New Jersey, they moved to Philadelphia, and they actually opened their own sewing business where they would make things like curtains and blankets and all those different things, and they were very successful. But when the Revolutionary War started, John joined up to fight the British. And in 1776, he was actually killed by a gunpowder explosion on the waterfront in Pennsylvania. So just 3 years after she got married to John, Betsy Ross was now what's called a widow, which is a woman whose husband has died. But she decided to keep running her shop and to keep running the sewing business. And she was very successful still, which was very, very good. I know it is a little sad. I realize that it's a little sad that that happened. And this is the house where some people, but not everybody, believes that she lived and worked in Philadelphia. It's now a museum where you can go. I think it's called the Betsy Ross Museum, if you guys want to look up pictures of it afterwards. And it is a living history museum. So if you were part of the webinar that I did on Jamestown, I showed some pictures of of the Jamestown settlement, which is a living history museum, where there's actually actors and people who are there who act like the people who would have lived at that time. And so you can interact with them and you can ask questions. You'll see in one of the next slides a picture of a woman who I think is Betsy Ross, or one of her 5 daughters. So she had 5 daughters, and all those girls worked with her in her sewing business. So it was a family business. Cypress, my costume today is Betsy Ross. So I did my best impression of Betsy Ross. And yes, I agree, this looks like a really cool museum. So here, this is just one of the rooms inside the museum. You can see it is like a bedroom where they have the furniture and some of the toys and different things, so you can see what it looks like. The next one is, that would be, I think that's the kitchen. So it sort of shows a little bit about the sewing. I think that young girl is supposed to be Betsy Ross's daughter, because of her daughters worked with her. But you can see some of the material, the things that they would be sewing, and the iron, which was really important when you were sewing because you wanted your fabric to be flat. Devin, great question. Did she have 5 daughters in 3 years, or did she get a new husband? Betsy Ross was actually married 3 times. So her first husband died, she got married again, had a couple daughters, her second husband died, and then she got married a final time. And that was those 3 daughters from there. Is there a separate shop for sewing? So I think they sewed in the spaces in their home. I'm not sure that she had an actual workshop there. Great question though. And here is another, this would be another bedroom within the house. You can see some furniture and curtains and things like that. So those were just some pictures of a museum so that you can kind of see a little bit of what her house looks like. Great. Okay, good. So it was soon after this that Betsy was recruited for a very important job. So she was asked to do a very important job, to make the very first American flag. George Washington knew her because they went to the same church and they attended some of the same functions. And he knew she was very good at sewing. So he gave her a design for the new flag and asked her to make it. However, she had some things she wanted to improve upon it, and they agreed with her ideas. And so they liked this new flag that they made. So they liked a lot of the things that she did. Now, I said earlier that we're not totally sure if she did the first flag or not, right? So it's just the best guess of the data that we have. And so here, Betsy Ross is famously known for making the first American flag. Is that true or false? So did she really sew the first American flag in 1776? When Betsy Ross was alive, during her lifetime, nobody actually called her the creator of the first American flag. It was about 100 years later when her grandson was talking to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which is a group of people that are interested in saving the history of a place and talking about history and studying history. And he brought up the idea that she maybe made the first flag. Her grandson said that General Washington and 2 other men, one of the other men was her husband's uncle, Colonel George Ross, came to visit Betsy and showed her the design, which had 13 red and white stripes and 13 stars. So the legend or the story says that she made some suggestions about the stars needing to have 5 points instead of 6 points. And that's kind of the story that we tell in history. But there's actually no proof that she sewed the first flag. And even afterwards, her grandson admitted that when he was looking for proof of that he wasn't actually able to solve, that. So that's just an example. It's just an example. I've talked before about history a lot of it is the stories that we tell about something, and stories sometimes get passed down from older generations to younger generations. And sometimes they're not true, and sometimes they're mostly true, or they're how people remember them. So this is just an example of that. Good. Yes, I think April, I'm not sure that she did do it, but I think it is definitely very possible that she did. Did they think the stars had 6 points? Yes, the story goes, Shayna, that the original drawing was that they came with a 6-pointed star, and she said, no, it would look better if they had a 5-pointed star. Lorna, is it a legend? I do think it's more of a story. I'm not sure if I would call it a legend, though I know I referred to it that way, but it's just kind of the story that we tell about this. So here is a picture. So no one has a copy of the first flag. That doesn't exist either, but it looks something like this. So there are 13 stripes of red and white, one for each of the original 13 colonies. And on the blue background in the upper left corner were 13 red and white stars. Though sometimes it's red and white and sometimes it's white, depending on what you read. They were arranged in a circle, kind of like the Knights of the Round Table, meaning that the colonies were equal and none were more important than the other. Another story that gets told about the circle of stars is that George Washington referred to it as a new constellation that would be in the sky. And constellations are, if you guys aren't familiar, are sort of patterns of stars in the sky, which you can then imagine or see that make a certain design or picture. Like the Big Dipper is a constellation, the Little Dipper is a constellation, Orion, they just are just a group of stars. Let's see if any questions. So, and since then, the flag's been changing over the years. Every time a new state joined the country after the Revolutionary War, they would add a new star. So now on our current flag, we have 50 stars on the blue background, but we still have 13 stripes so that we remember the 13 original colonies that won our independence. And Americans honor this flag because it represents the country and the idea of freedom. So the one to the left is what it looks like now. Okay, good. So Betsy Ross, besides being a real woman who may or may not have sewn the first American flag, is what we call a patriotic icon. So what is a patriotic icon? Patriotic means to show or have great pride or love of one's country. So if you're patriotic, you really love your country and you are very proud of it and you have a lot of pride about it. An icon is, in this case, means a famous person that represents an idea that people believe is good. So Betsy Ross represented women helping in the American Revolution, contributing to her country in a time when they really needed her. And it gave people, men and women, something to look up to and copy. Another example of another patriotic icon would be Rosie the Riveter. And if you were at my very first webinar, you remember I dressed up as her the very first time. And she was a patriotic icon during World War II, showing how women were contributing to the war effort while at home. I see a couple of you guys have raised your hands. Please remember to put it in the Q&A box and I will try to answer your question. Okay, let's see if I can get to some of these questions. Just 1 second. Lorna asked, why isn't there a circle of stars in the most current one? I think it's just because they couldn't fit it. And so they decided to come up with the idea of having it in rows. Betsy Ross' daughters are probably not still alive because it was about 300 years ago, but I'm sure that there are descendants of hers that did do that are still alive. So that's about Betsy Ross. I think she's really a very interesting woman who, you know, contributed something important to the story of the United States. Sorry, just one second, guys. Having a slight technical difficulty. Okay, so then the next person we're going to talk about is a man. His name is Thomas Paine. Somebody said earlier in the Q&A that he wrote a book, which is very true. He was a writer, and he wrote some important words which inspired the colonists to fight for their freedom. But we're going to talk a little bit about his life, just a little bit, so you can understand what came before he wrote those books. Sorry, just one second. So this is Thomas Paine. So who was he and why do we study him? So Thomas Paine was actually the first person to write a book or a pamphlet, which is like a thin little book, saying why the colonies needed to be independent of Britain. And he wrote it so simply that anyone could understand it. Some common people could understand it. Because of this book, many of the colonists decided to support the idea of independence. What book did he write? He wrote a book called Common Sense. He wrote a book called The Rights of Man, and just a few other ones. Cypress, I am not sure how old Betsy Ross was when she died, but that might be a great research thing to do once we finish this. So Thomas Paine was born in England in 1737. Growing up, he was a failure at almost everything he did. So he wasn't good at many things. He failed in school. He tried to work for his father as an apprentice, to work underneath him and learn the job that his father did. And he failed at doing that. And he even failed as a sailor. So there were many, many things that he was not good at. Then he got a job as a tax collector. And his job was to make sure that ships that came to England, like from the New World, from the Spice Islands, from all the places, paid taxes on all of the things that they had brought to trade. But he was even bad at that, and he got fired twice from his job. I see I have a couple of questions. Ethan asks, who's Rosie the Riveter? She was a woman who stood for other women, stood for women working in the factories during World War II to help with the war effort. They made things like planes, ships, weapons, things like that. April, I'm not sure the exact school that Thomas Paine went to, but it was probably whatever one was close to where he lived in England. What are taxes? Great question. Ethan, taxes are money that you pay on things that you buy or sell, and that money goes to the government to help pay for the things that the government, the services that the government offers. So at this time, you had to pay taxes on things like tea. If you wanted to buy or sell tea, you had to pay a little bit of extra money on top of that. Paper, glass, pretty much anything you could think of. Great question. How can you get fired from the same job twice? I think my next slide talks about that too, because I think they gave him another chance and then he messed up again. Oliver, great question. Shouldn't there be 51 stars because there's the District of Columbia? The District of Columbia isn't actually considered a state. They consider it a district. It's kind of similar to a state and different from a state at the same time. It's just a small area of land, but it's not actually considered its own state. Great question. Isaiah, yes, writing was one of the things that he was good at. So here, the other thing that he was good at was he was good at being observant. He was really good at noticing things. he noticed that amongst the English tax collectors, the men who were doing the same job as him, that there was corruption, which meant there were people who were breaking rules so that they could make extra money. Whether they would make them pay more taxes or in some way they were breaking the rules in order to do that. The traders would sometimes secretly give money to the tax collectors so the tax collectors would lower the amount they had to pay. So they would say, I'll give you this money if you make me only pay this amount of taxes. And when Thomas had the courage to report this, that's when he got fired for the second time. So he was doing the right thing, but he ended up getting fired. Shana, I'm glad that you like pictures. I think it's really a great way to sort of understand and see what history looks like. So one of the main things, so Thomas Paine, you can already tell from this story about him, was that he had a really strong sense of what was right and what was wrong. And he was willing to talk about it. So if he saw the things he saw that were incorrect, he had the courage and bravery to be able to speak about it. And he ended up getting fired, but at least he had spoken out about it. So that was an important thing. You're right, it's not fair, April. And Lorna, why would they fire him? They didn't like honest tax collectors. You're right. I don't know. It doesn't make sense right now why they would fire him, unless the people who were his boss were profiting or getting some kind of benefit from these not honest tax collectors, which is a possibility. Milo, great question. What is the District of Columbia? The District of Columbia is the area of the United States. It's not very big. I think it's maybe like 3 to 5 mile circle, and it's where where the government of the United States is. So it's where the president lives. It's where the White House is. It's where the parts of the United States government that make the laws and the courts are. So it's kind of the headquarters of the whole government of the United States. I hope that answers your question. Okay, good. So I'm not sure if anybody else was fired for it, but I know the story that he was. So about this time, Thomas Paine had the good fortune to meet Benjamin Franklin in London. And Franklin actually helped him move to Philadelphia, which is in Pennsylvania and one of the colonies. And it was there that Thomas found out he was good and maybe even great at one other thing, which was writing. So there was a newspaper called the Pennsylvania Magazine, and he wrote for that for about a year and a half. And he wrote about all kinds of things, but one of his most famous articles was about how bad the slave trade was. And the slave trade was bringing slaves from Africa to the United States in exchange for goods and money. So that was one of the things. So that's just another example of him showing that he felt really strongly about what was right and what was wrong, and that he wasn't afraid to talk about it. He had a lot of courage and what I would call integrity, which is kind of knowing what's right and knowing what's true, and then talking about it, even if it might get you in trouble, or maybe if other people might not like it, but still having that courage and bravery to talk about those things. And you are right, Isaiah, it was not fair to do that to him. So Thomas had observed how things worked in England when he was working there before, and he now was observing how things worked in the colonies. And he could see that the best way forward for the colonies, the best path for them, was to be free from England. So in 1775, he wrote his ideas about this in a short book, and it was called Common Sense. It was easy to understand, it made a lot of sense, and it became really popular. And soon many more people started wanting independence. One thing to know about this little book that he wrote was that he wrote it, but his name wasn't on it. He wrote it what's called anonymously, where you don't include your name. And one of the reasons that he wrote it anonymously was because it was dangerous to say that. He was a colonist. The colony still belonged to England. He was still supposed to be loyal to the king and to speak about wanting independence and speak about the things that the king had done and the things that were not fair was maybe very dangerous for him. And he could have possibly been arrested and maybe even killed for speaking out in that way. So when it was first originally written, it was written anonymously. So we didn't know until much later that it was actually written by Thomas Paine. April, why don't you type into the Q&A box and I will try to answer your question. It looks like what is happening in this picture, that's a really good question. I think that it is a demonstration or a protest for independence. And sometimes during the Revolutionary War, they would take a dummy or like what we would consider a mannequin today of the king and or someone who they felt was being unfair to them, and they would demonstrate that they didn't like him. So rather than actually hurting a person or going after or being rough with that, they would do it with a dummy. I hope that answers your question. How did they find out that he wrote the book much later? I'm sure some people knew that he did it, like his friends did it, but it wasn't well talked about. But much later, when it was safer, probably after the United States had started and he was no longer a British citizen, but an American, it was safe for him to do it. Is his book still available today? Yes, Nora, you can actually read his book today. I've read both of them. They are some of my favorite books. I really, really like them. And so, yes, you can definitely still find it today. What are they doing with the dummy? I think they're just showing that they didn't like the king and maybe just like hoisting him around. When you write something and put it under a fake name, isn't that called a pseudonym? Yes, it is a pseudonym, but he actually didn't even put a name on it. It was just like common sense. So this little book that he wrote is called a pamphlet. And a pamphlet is just a short collection of pages. And he was what was called a pamphleteer, which is a person who writes pamphlets, these small books of printed information about a certain subject. And he had a lot of influence as a pamphleteer, and he was able to change a lot of people's minds about things. Some of his most important pamphlets were The Age of Reason, which had to do with what place religion has in society, The Rights of Man, which is a piece defending the French Revolution, and Common Sense, which was published during the American Revolution. And here next are some pictures of his pamphlets. So you guys can see some pictures of that. Let me just see if I can answer any questions. Yes, Annette, you can find them in the bookstore today. You might even be able to find them online for free. But I know I have them in my library. We have about 11 more minutes, Kiosha. Thank you for asking. So as you guys can see here, on the first one, I don't actually think on the Common Sense one, it doesn't say the name of the author. You can see that that is anonymous. The middle one does say that he wrote it, so that must be a later copy of it. And then The Age of Reason also says that he wrote it. Good question, Lorna. Why does the middle one look golden? I think it's just an older, just a different picture of it. These weren't all the same pictures of 3 ones, but just the ones I found. Abel, now, when the books are printed now or talked about, we credit him as the author. But at the time, he did not put his name on it. So these are just later ones. We're going to end. Dylan, I hope I said your name right. We'll end for you at 2 o'clock. So after the Revolutionary War started, Thomas wrote more articles in support of it. Some of these things that he wrote were actually, they were used by General George Washington during the cold winter of 1777 and 1778, when his army was at Valley Forge and they were feeling so unhappy because they didn't have enough supplies, they didn't have enough food, they were cold, and they were pretty miserable. At that time, many decided to leave the army rather than stay and live through that miserable time. But General Washington, in order to help with that, ordered all of his troops to read his words so that it could help keep them together and give them hope. Sorry, guys. I know you guys have some good questions. I'm just trying to get to them. He was not put in jail, but it was a possibility that he would be put in jail, so he didn't. And Lorna asked, didn't many people die in the winter at Valley Forge? Yes, many did. Though I know you guys are probably going to ask me how many did, and I don't have the exact number, but that would be a great thing for you guys to look up. So one of the things that that we say, and there's an old saying that the pen is mightier than the sword, which means the pen and writing can be stronger than anything that is maybe violent, swords, guns. It means that in civilization, in the way we live, ideas are more important than bullets. Britain had more bullets, but Americans had more powerful ideas. And he used his writing, he used his pen to spread those ideas and really inspire the people to fight for this freedom. So while he was not very good at many jobs, and he got fired many times, and there were many things that he failed at, he was very good at coming up with important ideas about freedom and writing them in a way that everybody could understand. So in many, many ways, we have Thomas Paine to thank for the success of the American Revolution and the freedom that we have come to enjoy. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about him. Why I think he is an important part of the story of the American Revolution and the part that he played. And I wanted to thank you guys for joining me on my webinar today and asking such great questions and learning about American history with me. And I hope you guys will join me. I'm going to do one more this week. We're going to do a couple more about the American Revolution. And then we will probably move on to the next thing. So if you're interested, please sign up. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Bye. I'm so happy that you guys could be here.